Super Mario Odyssey is the 18th game in the Super Mario series, and being the latest home console entry for the Nintendo Switch, it's been met with some exceedingly high expectations. After the release of Super Mario Galaxy in 2007, fans have been feverish to play something on par with the earlier entries in the series. While Super Mario Galaxy 2 and Super Mario 3D World were good games, there's no denying that Super Mario Odyssey is finally the true sequel that we've all been waiting for. To put it bluntly, I've been waiting around 10 years to play a game like Super Mario Odyssey, and no one had higher expectations for this game than me. Now that I've gotten a chance to play through the game, I think that it was really good, but there are also a couple of problems that I wanted to address. For this video, I'm going to spoil the entire game. If you haven't beaten Super Mario Odyssey, then I'd recommend watching this video until after you reach the end credits. After all, one of the most unpredictable things that has ever happened in a Super Mario game happens right at the start of the game. So once again, here is a spoiler warning. Anyways, the game starts with Bowser kidnapping Princess Peach because it's a fucking Mario game. In a failed attempt to save the princess, Mario is knocked off of Bowser's ship and lands in the Cap Kingdom. It's here where you're quickly introduced to Cappy, and he tells Mario that Bowser has also captured his little sister. So through similar goals, Cappy and Mario decide to team up in order to stop Bowser and save their respective partners. It's a pretty simple story, but it's also told within a couple of minutes, introduces the main crux of the story, and doesn't waste too much time. It's at this part of the game where we can acclimate ourselves to controlling Mario. One of my first concerns going into Super Mario Odyssey was that Mario's movement would be simplified like in Super Mario Galaxy and Super Mario 3D World. Luckily, this wasn't the case, since Super Mario Odyssey has brought back the more subtle movement mechanics from Super Mario 64 and Super Mario Sunshine. Chaining moves together feels as fluid as ever, with each move effectively changing or retaining the momentum of Mario's previous actions. For example, if Mario is moving faster than his running speed, he can conserve that momentum through the use of a triple jump, allowing Mario to move at extremely high speeds. Performing a triple jump from a running start doesn't match the speed in the slightest, and when comparing them side by side, this difference is really easy to notice. This subtle gameplay mechanic hasn't been seen since Super Mario Sunshine, and it's one of the major reasons why I preferred Mario's movement in those earlier games. Regarding Mario's moveset, his long jump, backflip, side flip, triple jump, wall jump, and ground pound have been carried over from the previous games with little to no changes. Mario's roll has also been carried over from Super Mario 3D World, which works in tandem with Mario's other moves to help maintain his momentum. A brand new addition to Super Mario Odyssey is the ground pound jump, which mostly just functions as another form of a high jump. Considering that the ground pound has always been a total momentum killer in the previous games, it's nice to see that this addition allows Mario to keep moving. Mario's spin jump has also made a return, but this time it's so useless that I never considered using it once throughout the entire game. Instead of using the superior spin jump from Super Mario Sunshine, Super Mario Odyssey borrows the clunky spin jump from Super Mario 3D World, where you have to wait for Mario to be spinning before you can perform the jump. The startup on this move alone brings Mario to a complete stop, and the jump itself is so floaty that it's not even worth the effort. Unlike the roll and the ground pound jump, this move doesn't work well in tandem with Mario's other abilities, making it a pretty impractical move to perform. Mario can also perform his dive from Super Mario 64 and Sunshine, but this time it acts in a completely different way. Instead of simply pressing the B button, it's now performed in tandem with the ground pound, making the move feel incredibly static. This means that the jump arc of the dive will always be the same no matter what moves are performed before it. At first glance, this felt incredibly jarring, but it somehow ended up being the most useful move in the game, since it can be used to essentially double jump in the air. While there are some changes I dislike, Mario himself feels as good as he's ever been. It really feels like Nintendo has nailed the physics of Mario's motion to near perfection. With that said, you could assume that Super Mario Odyssey has the best movement out of all the 3D Super Mario games, but we have to remember that Mario isn't alone. Cappy also plays a very important role in Mario's moveset, and this is where I feel like the game falls a bit short. The main use of Cappy is to throw him with the X or Y button, which is is mostly used to hit objects or smaller enemies. Throwing Cappy also functions as a way to adjust your movement in midair, similar to the spin attack in Super Mario Galaxy. This allows Mario to more accurately land in the intended direction of a jump, which can be a lifesaver in certain situations. By holding the X or Y button, you can also hold Cappy in place in order to perform a high jump. While it can be used on the ground, it's more practical to use it in midair, since it allows Mario to jump greater distances. In fact, one of the most overpowered moves in the game is using the midair cap jump in tandem with Mario's dive. Since his dive will always travel the same distance every time, you can use it consistently with the cap throw and never have to worry about missing Cappy. After jumping off a Cappy, you can also throw Cappy again and perform another dive again, essentially performing a triple jump. The cap dive combo is incredibly overpowered because it can be used to travel across the longest gaps and the highest gaps at the same time. For example, if you want to jump across a long gap, you start your cap dive combo with a long jump, but if you want to jump across a high gap, you start it off with a high jump instead. Mix in a wall jump in between and you'd be surprised how often you can just jump over large gaps. Of course, the main gimmick of Super Mario Odyssey is using Cappy's capture ability to take control over certain enemies and objects. On a surface level, this is a really great addition. It provides Mario with a ton of utility that he wouldn't normally have, which is inherently a good thing. The problem I personally have with Cappy is that the utility it provides often removes a lot more than it adds. Whenever Mario is in control of another enemy, his moveset is often extremely simplified, usually revolving around only pressing one or two buttons. Because of this, the capture mechanic is mostly used as a method to solve puzzles, which doesn't add much to the platforming. For example, whenever you're in control of a Goomba, most of the gaps that you have to cross are extremely short because the game limits Mario's moveset. After all, you can't triple jump, you can't wall jump, you can't side flip, you can't dive in the air, you can't use your momentum to increase your speed, and you can't even use Cappy while you're controlling an enemy. As a result, the game can't challenge the player to an interesting platforming segment while you're in control of a Goomba. Now, that's not to say that Super Mario Odyssey doesn't use Cappy for platforming, but I'd argue that it's very simplistic. As an uproot, the only thing you can do is stretch your body upwards. As a tropical wiggler, the only thing you can do is stretch your body horizontally. As a bullet bill, the only thing you can do is fly forward or fly forward slightly faster. The novelty of controlling the enemies can be enjoyable at times, but after a while it just gets too stale because of the lack of variety. You could say that the wide range of enemies gives Mario a ton of utility, but that doesn't really matter because Mario can only control one enemy at a time. It doesn't matter that Mario can jump really high as a frog when he's in control of a Hammer Bro. It doesn't matter that Mario can shoot objects with a tank when he's in control of a Cheep Cheep. If you can't access all of these abilities during the moment, they might as well be completely irrelevant. After all, one of the defining aspects of the 3D Super Mario games is Mario's wide variety of moves. The challenge and fun of the home console entries is having the ability to chain together all of Mario's moves at the same time. Personally, this is why I feel like the capture mechanic feels a bit underwhelming. By limiting Mario's moveset, it removes the entire reason of playing a 3D Super Mario game. In comparison to Flood from Super Mario Sunshine, Cappy feels incredibly underwhelming. In fact, the only new ability that improves Mario's platforming is the cap jump, which is honestly a huge disappointment. There's a lot of ways you can jump off a Cappy, but at the end of the day, Cappy is just a glorified spring pad. On the other hand, Flood provided a ton of utility that affected Mario's movement. The best thing about Super Mario Sunshine is that Mario and Flood can both combine their abilities and become greater than the sum of its parts. There are so many intricate things that you can pull off with just the simple press of an R button, which is why I think that Super Mario Sunshine has some of the best movement options in the series. Cappy doesn't work in the same way that Flood does. While they're technically working together, there's never any moments where their abilities complement each other in a brand new way. You're either stuck with the capture mechanic playing as an enemy, or you're mostly jumping around as Mario and using Cappy as a floating step stool. I also think that the pollution in Super Mario Sunshine played a very important role in making Flood a worthwhile addition. The pollution Pollution was a constant hazard all throughout the game, but Flood could remove the pollution by spraying water, which in turn affected the way that Mario traversed the level. Flood's ability to spray water is entirely dependent on what Mario is doing during the time, which means that Flood can be used to clean up the pollution in many different ways. On the other hand, Cappy's capture mechanic only has one tried and true method to solving puzzles. Mario's ability to solve problems is entirely dependent on what enemies just happen to be around, meaning that most players will perform every action by using these same exact methods. At the end of the day, Cappy doesn't add enough variety to the platforming, and the challenges revolving around the capture mechanic involve a lot of repetition. Unsurprisingly, there are also some moves that can only be performed through the use of the motion controls. You can throw Cappy upward or downward with their respective motions, and you can also perform a spin throw by horizontally tilting both Joy-Cons in the same direction. Shaking the controller after throwing Cappy can also make Cappy use a homing attack, which can be used to more accurately hit your target. Although the game says that these moves are exclusive to the motion controls, some of them can be performed through the use of button presses. For example, if you throw Cappy while in the spinning animation, you can perform the spin throw, which seems to make logical sense. The only issue is that the slow startup on the spinning animation means that the spin throw carries the same delay. As a result, the spin throw is at its best when being used with the motion controls, which can be frustrating for players who would rather press a button. Mario can also use the downward throw after using a ground pound, which is mainly used to throw Cappy longer distances. Again, since this move can only be used with the ground pound, it's created an additional delay as well. Although the game has created button combinations that allow these moves to be performed, they've been implemented in such a way that it incentivizes the use of the motion controls rather than creating a simple alternative. That's not even going into the issue that the upward throw and the homing attack don't have a button press variation. This can be a major problem for players who would rather play this game with the Joy-Cons attached to the Switch, because moving the controllers also means moving the screen at the same time, which makes the motion controls near impossible to perform. To make things worse, the developers have also created motion control moves that are slightly better than the button pressed variants. Sometimes shaking the controller will make Mario perform an action much faster, or sometimes it'll even lock away a certain ability behind the motion controls for seemingly no reason. For example, you can fly faster with the Paragoomba, you can perform a jump dash with the lava bubble, and you can perform a higher jump with the frog. When Mario is capturing an enemy, only 2 buttons are in use, which means the developers could have placed these motion control variants on literally any other button, but just decided not to. This has to be the most passive-aggressive thing Nintendo has ever done, because it seems like Nintendo is punishing players who don't play with Nintendo's preferred method of control, which is just kinda stupid. Now, don't get me wrong, I think the motion controls work pretty flawlessly when you're playing the game with 2 Joy-Cons. Within the first couple of minutes, I was able to perform all of Mario's moves with some simple movements of my wrist. Although motion controls can be somewhat obnoxious, I still think that using subtle movements can be an intuitive way to control video games. On the other hand, some people outright dislike motion controls and would rather disable them at any chance they can get, which is why the developers should have prioritized the use of the button commands. This is where I think the game has failed, because a lot of the buttons have overlapping uses for seemingly no reason. Mario's jump is mapped to both the A and B buttons, throwing Cappy is mapped to both the X and Y buttons, resetting the camera is mapped to both the L and R buttons, and Mario's crouch is mapped to both the ZL and ZR buttons. I know the process of creating button mapping can be pretty complicated, but the amount of overlapping buttons is just wasteful. It's frustrating because some of Mario's moveset is now locked behind the motion controls when there are plenty of options that could have been used. You could have pressed the ZR button to perform the spin throw, you could have held the L button and then pressed X or Y to perform an upward or downward throw, you could have pressed the alternate throw button to activate the homing attack, and they could have just mapped the dive move to the B button. Some of these implementations might feel slightly awkward, but there's clearly 4 overlapping buttons that might have created some kind of solution. At a first glance, the button mapping in this game is just baffling, but it all made sense once I discovered that you could play the game with 2 players. In this mode, one player controls Mario with a single Joy-Con, while the other controls Cappy with the other Joy-Con. In contrast to the single player, the button mapping for the multiplayer feels incredibly tight. They even removed one of the extra throw buttons and used it as a method to rotate the camera. It might seem like a harmless addition, but the inclusion of this mode has had a negative impact impact on the single player experience. Looking at the button mapping, it seems like Nintendo has designed this game from the ground up to work with only one Joy-Con. For example, the single player controls have 4 trigger buttons, and the sideways Joy-Cons for the local 2-player mode only have 2 trigger buttons. They could have used these 4 trigger buttons to help improve Mario's moveset for the single player, but this would mean that the controls for the multiplayer would no longer work. So, instead of using these buttons to improve Mario's moveset, Nintendo must have placed priority on making this game work with only one Joy-Con, since having the local 2-player mode was obviously one of the main features of the Nintendo Switch. It's annoying, because now Mario's moveset is being determined by this extra mode that the majority of players will probably never use. Personally, I would have preferred that Nintendo put priority on the single player experience instead, because in its current state, the controls have been dumbed down in order to include this feature. Even if you decide to purchase an extra pair of Joy-Cons solely for the use of the multiplayer, you're still being limited by the bare minimum requirements. So, although there are a ton of overlapping buttons that could have been used to improve Mario's moveset, Nintendo has decided to ignore these buttons in order to promote the capabilities of the Nintendo Switch instead. After making your way through the Cap Kingdom, Mario eventually ends up in the Cascade Kingdom. The immediate goal of this level is to restore the Odyssey by collecting power moons, which act as fuel to power the ship. Once the ship is restored, the Odyssey becomes the main method of transport to travel between levels. Because of this, Super Mario Odyssey has chosen to once again use a level select screen instead of an overworld hub, which is probably one of the more disappointing aspects of the game. One of the issues with using a level select screen is that it forces the player through a bottleneck of predetermined levels. Linearity isn't a bad thing, but I'd argue that the fun of the earlier games was having the freedom to choose which levels you wanted to play, which is why I personally prefer the overworld hubs. The game tries to alleviate this problem by sometimes giving the player a choice between 2 levels, but it doesn't really matter because the game forces you to play through both levels anyways. As a result, the freedom of choice has been completely taken away from the player, which runs in total opposition to the established Power Star system. After all, the entire system around collecting stars revolves around the assumption that players can go to different levels and collect them in any order they wish. For example, I've done multiple playthroughs of Super Mario 64 where I never went to Jolly Roger Bay. I don't really hate this level, but I'm not a huge fan of swimming, so I'd rather go to the other levels instead. Luckily, since the game is structured around the overworld hub, the player can curate which levels they want to play and which ones they want to ignore. The only goal of Super Mario 64 is to collect 70 Power Stars, which means that it's not required to get every single star in the game. If you want to collect all of the stars in one level and get 1 star in another, there's not that much stopping you from doing that. By the time that you get to the end of the game, you'll have spent most of your time playing the levels that you enjoyed the most, which is one of the strengths of having an overworld hub. Super Mario Odyssey doesn't follow this structure in the slightest. Although you aren't required to collect every power moon in the game, you still have to collect a minimum amount of power moons per level, which isn't nearly as fun. For example, the minimum amount of power moons required to beat the Lost Kingdom is 10. The amount of power moons you collected up to this point of the game will have no impact on this number at all. It will always be 10 no matter what you do. In the previous games, the total amount of power stars you've collected would usually determine which levels you could unlock next, but this is something that Super Mario Odyssey doesn't do. As a result, the only thing that this requirement does is force players to play through each level, which feels like an unnecessary limitation. It's really the worst of both worlds. If you dislike a level and you'd rather move on to the next level, you're now being forced to collect the minimum amount of power moons required. On the other hand, if you really enjoy a level and you'd love to collect a lot of power moons, you're now being incentivized to move on to the next level anyways, because your total power moon count has no impact on unlocking new levels. As a result, unless you're aiming for 100% completion, collecting power moons past this minimum amount is just a waste of your time. After restoring the Odyssey, Mario and Cappy make their way towards the Sand Kingdom, which is where I feel like the game truly starts. Unlike the Cap Kingdom and Cascade Kingdom, this is the first massive level that has an overwhelming amount of power moons to collect. In many ways, the levels in Super Super Mario Odyssey feel like an extension of Super Mario 64, where finding the power stars would involve more open-ended exploration. Most of the power moons can be found all throughout the level, which will usually involve the same kind of puzzle solving that was done in Super Mario 64. The catch to this is that you'll also receive the same kind of missions from Sunshine and Galaxy, which will highlight a power moon and push the player along a specific path. Most of the missions aren't required to complete, but they do benefit the player by unlocking more power moons throughout the level. For example, some of the power moons in the Sand Kingdom are locked away behind blocks of ice, which will only melt once you defeat the boss. This means that despite having prior knowledge of where every power moon is located, you'll still be drawn to completing the objectives anyways, since they will help you gain access to more power moons. As a result, the optional objectives end up feeling more mandatory than they should, which ends up pushing players towards a more linear experience. For a game that boasts about how much freedom it has, it seems strange that there are so many gameplay mechanics that enforce the exact opposite. The Power Moon requirements forces players to play through each level, the level select menu determines what levels you travel to next, and the objective-based missions limit how many Power Moons you can collect at a time. I think the reason that these limits are in place is because there are an exorbitant amount of Power Moons per level. To put this in perspective, the minimum amount of Power Stars required to beat the previous games was around 50 to 70 stars, while the minimum amount of Power Moons required to beat Super Mario Odyssey is 124. Considering how large the levels are in Super Mario Odyssey, this seems like a reasonable change. However, the real issue is that the previous games had a total amount of 120 stars, while Super Mario Odyssey has decided to increase the total amount to 999 for seemingly no reason. This means that the previous games only required you to collect around half of the total amount, while Super Mario Odyssey only requires you to collect around 1/8 of the total amount. The problem with this is that Super Mario Odyssey has roughly the same amount of levels as the previous games, which means that this giant surplus of Power Moons hasn't been spread out properly. For example, the Sand Kingdom alone has 69 Power Moons on your first visit, which is more than half the amount required to beat the entire game. If Super Mario Odyssey followed the unlock structure as the previous games, it could have been entirely possible to collect all of the Power Moons on 2 levels, skip around 80% of the entire game, and then beat the last level. So, in order to fix this problem that Nintendo has created for themselves, they now have to limit the player's ability to curate which levels they want to play, which I personally think is one of the worst aspects of the game. It could have been possible to design this game like the previous games, but it feels like Nintendo went into development wanting the game to have 999 Power Moons rather than just designing the levels and finding a total amount that's more appropriate. After all, there's nothing that special about the number 120. The only reason that Super Mario 64 had 120 stars was because there were 15 levels in the game, and that's probably the number that they found the most acceptable. The previous games didn't have any issues with this because the total star count wasn't blown out of proportion to the minimum amount of power stars required to beat the game. In fact, Super Mario Galaxy 2 had already implemented a level select screen that allows players to backtrack and collect stars. That game didn't have to place these arbitrary limits on the player because they just balance the game properly. In comparison, the 999 maximum Power Moon count has made Super Mario Odyssey feel a bit bloated. Every level is stuffed to the brim with Power Moons, which means that the Power Moons have become a lot more common than the Power Stars of the previous games. Some of the Power Moons will involve the same kind of platforming challenges we've seen in the past, but others will be much easier to find. Sometimes they're just hidden underground, sometimes they're tucked away behind small corners, and others are sitting right in plain sight. As a result, you'll be finding Power Moons at a much faster rate, which has made them feel less valuable. I think the biggest factor in determining the value of the Power Moons mostly comes down to the amount of collectibles in the level in relation to its size. For example, the levels in Super Mario 64 are pretty small, but considering that each level only has 6 stars, the size is actually quite fitting. In contrast, the levels in Super Mario Odyssey are much larger, but the exorbitant amount of Power Moons ends up dwarfing the levels and making the Power Moons much more common. When you compare the density of the Power stars between both games, the difference is pretty obvious. For example, Bomb on Battlefield is the first level in Super Mario 64 that holds 6 stars, and the amount of space that the level occupies seems pretty fitting. In comparison, the Metro Kingdom has the same amount of power moons within this tiny block of space. Not only is this section much smaller than Bomb on Battlefield, but it also features no enemies, no platforms, and is pretty much completely flat. When you look at the density of power moons in other areas of the game, this issue only becomes more apparent. If you took these small sections of Super Mario Odyssey and placed them into Super Mario 64, these levels would be abysmally small, provide absolutely no platforming challenges, and have more power stars than necessary. This is the subtle difference between both of these games. While Super Mario 64 was able to spread out the power stars all throughout each level, Super Mario Odyssey stuffs in as many power moons as possible and hardly presents a challenge. This lack of challenge is mostly due to the way the levels are designed. Aesthetically, each level in Super Mario Odyssey has a somewhat grounded tone, similar to the levels in Super Mario Sunshine. While the art style for both games can be cartoony and slightly exaggerated, the levels themselves feel like they are somewhat based in reality. Because of this design choice, it's a lot harder to create challenging platforming sections within the levels themselves, since they wanted each level to make logical sense. In contrast, the levels in Super Mario 64 and Galaxy are more abstract and nonsensical. Each level had a specific theme that ties everything together, but in the grand scheme of things, it's all just a bunch of nonsense mashed together for really no reason. Since these levels aren't based in reality, the developers can haphazardly place platforms anywhere they want without having to worry about things looking realistic. As a result, these kinds of levels are able to consistently challenge the player with more traditional platforming sections. This is why Super Mario Sunshine and Super Mario Odyssey have both resorted to hiding linear challenges throughout each level, which both switch over to the more abstract design of 64 and Galaxy. The difference between both of these games is that Sunshine used these sections to create some of the most brutal challenges in the entire series. One of the most infamous parts about these sections is that FLUDD is usually taken away from the player, removing Mario's most useful abilities. In comparison, these sections in Super Mario Odyssey feel pretty tame, mostly because they revolve around using Cappy's capture ability. Because of this, the game rarely takes away Cappy from the player, which means that you'll always be able to use Mario's cap dive combo to your advantage. There's a handful of challenges that do remove Cappy, but these sections are few and far between, with most of them being unlocked until after you've beaten the game. Even if there were more of these challenges, the power moons that are hidden inside them are completely optional anyways, so players can just completely avoid them. Certain players might be disappointed by this, but for me personally, I never played the 3D Super Mario games expecting some sort of rigorous challenge. I always found that the skill ceiling of the 3D Super Mario games mostly revolves around the player's ability to manipulate Mario's movement, and in that respect, there's a lot of potential for players to push themselves to go above and beyond what's required. Still, I can't deny that Super Mario Odyssey lacks a lot of challenging platforming sections, which will probably disappoint some players. Speaking of the level design, one of the issues that a lot of people have with this game is the juxtaposition of the cartoony and realistic graphics. Personally, I don't have a major issue with it, but I can imagine that many people would probably disagree. I've even seen some people go as far to say that the graphical art style is outright terrible because it's similar to the horrible Sonic games that have done the same exact thing. Personally, I think that's a pretty narrow-minded way of looking at things, but I can still understand where some players are coming from. After all, most people who enjoy the Super Mario series have always expected each game to have a certain amount of polish, but the juxtaposition in Super Mario Odyssey can sometimes make the game feel like an amateur effort. If I have to be honest, I think that the graphical juxtaposition in the Sonic series is really fucking stupid. With that said, the use in Super Mario Odyssey is actually pretty clever, considering that the entire game revolves around traveling across the world and discovering new and exciting things. Traveling outside of the Mushroom Kingdom isn't something that's new to the Super Mario series, but Super Mario Odyssey feels like the first game in the series to truly step outside of it. For example, Super Mario Galaxy took place in outer space and there was nothing in the entire game that ever felt alien. It took place across multiple galaxies, millions of miles apart, but it always felt like each galaxy was just a small chunk of rock that was ripped out of the Mushroom Kingdom. On the other hand, Super Mario Odyssey is able to make you feel like you are exploring places that Mario has never been before, which is something that the graphical juxtaposition was able to achieve. It might seem a bit strange when Mario is interacting with realistic humans, but that's the whole point. The citizens in New Donk City are living in a completely different kingdom halfway across the world, and the graphical juxtaposition is a clever way to show the drastic differences between the Mushroom Kingdom and the Metro Kingdom. Of course, some players might be worried that this has created some sort of earth-shattering consequences in terms of how the Mario universe works. Personally, I was deeply thinking about this as Mario was on a moped dressed as a clown, riding away from a T-Rex wearing aviator goggles, and I've come to the conclusion that maybe Nintendo doesn't really give a shit. Now, in all seriousness, I can't deny that some people will dislike this no matter what I say. Obviously, you can jump through all this logic and create some artsy, elaborate explanation on why this graphical juxtaposition works, but on a surface level, it just kinda looks like shit, so I can't really blame people. I feel like the issue that a lot of players have is that some things will look like they belong in the Mario universe while other things won't. For example, the Toastarians feel like a perfect fit for the Mario universe, while the T-Rex sticks out like a sore thumb. The common complaint that I've heard about the more realistic designs is that they could have just given them a more cartoony look and made everything look more unified. While I can understand why people would want that, I still think that this juxtaposition works pretty well with what the game set out to accomplish. After all, my favorite level in the entire game was the Metro Kingdom, and if this level was designed with the more cartoony look, I don't think it would be nearly as good. The charm of this level is that Mario is completely outside of his element, and seeing the drastic contrast between Mario and the Metro Kingdom is one of my personal highlights of the entire game. If all of these characters looked similar to Mario, then this would have taken away from one of the most unique aspects of the entire level, while also making the Metro Kingdom feel a lot more similar to the Mushroom Kingdom. Maybe some people would prefer that, but I'd argue that the entire premise of the game revolves around Mario leaving the Mushroom Kingdom, so obviously the developers should be breaking away from what's already been established. Now, that's not to say that every level in the game should adhere to this realistic art style, but I'd argue that the Metro Kingdom works the best because it's one of the only levels that committed to creating a brand new kingdom that was removed from the Mushroom Kingdom. The Ruined Kingdom also accomplished this very well, which features some of the best juxtaposition in the entire game. While this level was pretty short, it still felt like a completely unique setting that has never existed in the previous Mario games. This is also why I enjoyed the Luncheon Kingdom, since I've never seen any lava levels in the previous games that had this kind of visual flair. On the other hand, some of the most boring levels in the game weren't able to break away from the Mushroom Kingdom, mostly because they were slightly derivative. For example, the Lake Kingdom is just the same kinds of water levels that we've seen in the past, the Lost Kingdom is just another jungle setting filled with pits of poison, the Snow Kingdom is just another variation of a snow level, and the Seaside Kingdom is once again another beach level. These levels aren't bad, but they just aren't that exciting to discover when they feature a theme that's already been done to death in the previous Super Mario games. It also doesn't help that Super Mario Odyssey uses the more typical enemy designs that are originally from the Mushroom Kingdom. After all, the entire premise of Super Mario Odyssey is about discovering new and exciting things, and it's not that exciting to run into Goombas and Piranha Plants. Every level in the game should have always felt like uncharted territory, but using the old enemy designs has accomplished the exact opposite. That's why I can't blame people for disliking the more realistically designed characters, because most of the levels in the game are actually more traditional than they should have been, which ends up making the realistic designs feel more out of place. For example, the Cascade Kingdom is supposed to be a prehistoric world filled with dinosaurs, but it also features Chain Chomps from the Mushroom Kingdom. Some people seem to complain that the T-Rex looks out of place, but in actuality, it's the Chain Chomps that should have been changed to fit the theme of the world. If the Chain Chomps were changed to a brand new enemy type, then this would have helped isolate this world from the Mushroom Kingdom, making it more fun to discover. I don't mind when Nintendo reuses old ideas in their new games, but the entire premise of Super Mario Odyssey really required them to step outside of their comfort zone, and honestly, there aren't that many levels that do that. Now, I've noticed that I've been pretty negative towards the game up to this point, so I'd just like to remind you that I do really enjoy this game. While I dislike the linearity of the game, I still had a fun time playing through each level, even though water levels that I disliked in the previous games have been improved with the use of the capture system, making these swimming sections much more enjoyable. The linear nature of the game has also given it a really consistent flow that I can't say has been in any of the earlier 3D Super Mario games. The earlier games would usually boot the player out of the level every time you'd collect a star, but Super Mario Odyssey rarely interrupts the player, which means that you'll be spending most of your time just playing the game and collecting power moons. You start each level moving towards the objective, you pick up as many power moons as you can find on the side, and before you know it, you'll already have enough power moons to move on to the next level. Even the most derivative levels were able to introduce some new enemy types that were fun to capture as Cappy. The Metro Kingdom was definitely the highlight, but every level in the game has enough content to keep you engaged throughout the entire experience. That's the entire game in a nutshell, and I enjoyed everything while the game was in motion. With that said, I suppose this now leads us into the final level. After a long chase around the world, Mario and Cappy eventually catch up to the wedding ceremony on the moon, which is where the final boss fight against Bowser takes place. Now, I've seen that some people have been disappointed by the ending, but honestly, it's probably the most grandiose ending to a 3D Super Mario game to date. Usually, the final section of the previous games would involve a final platforming section with a final fight against Bowser to close out the game. All the previous games have ended by using the same exact formula, but Super Mario Odyssey is one of the first games that ends with a finale section after you defeat Bowser. In this section, the entire arena starts to collapse, and Mario has to rescue Princess Peach by taking control over Bowser. Playing as Bowser was a great way to reincorporate the capture mechanic one last time, and the final ending theme featuring vocals from Pauline was a really fun way to close out the game. It's also a clever way to reintroduce the moon rocks that will be used to unlock more power moons in the post-game. The final cutscene of the game was a bit silly, but I suppose that the entire journey across the world was arguably just as goofy, so I'm perfectly fine with it. Overall, I think it's one of the best endings to a Super Mario game to date. Despite a lot of the issues that I've had with Super Mario Odyssey, my first playthrough was a pretty enjoyable experience. While the total power moon count has been blown out of proportion, the game still ends at an appropriate length, so most players will have a satisfying ending whether or not they decide to continue playing. I can imagine that most players will stop playing after the credits, but as a longtime fan of the series, I was always planning on achieving 100% completion. So that's exactly what I did. The post-game for Super Mario Odyssey is probably one of the most daunting tasks for any Super Mario game to date. In order to achieve 100% completion, you have to collect all of the power moons you missed on your first playthrough, all of the hidden purple coins located throughout each level, and an additional set of power moons that are unlocked through the moon rocks. On my first playthrough, I spent around 11 hours casually going through each level and collecting around 230 power moons. Up to this point, I would say that the time I spent with Super Mario Odyssey was all a worthwhile experience, but sadly, the post-game is where the quality of the game starts to diminish. Like I said before, the total power moon count has made the entire game feel bloated, and the post-game has compounded this issue to the point where most players will never achieve 100% completion. The major issue with the post-game is that there isn't enough content to warrant the amount of time it takes to collect every power moon. You unlock the Mushroom Kingdom once you beat the game, but that's really the only new level. The dark side of the moon is just a tiny level with a quick boss rush with the Brutals, and the darker side of the moon is just one final linear challenge. The rest of the post-game is spent retreading the older levels by doing the same exact things you've been doing up to this point. There are some minor challenges that are brand new, but for the most part, the entire post-game is spent regurgitating older challenges in order to justify the total power moon count. Whether it's collecting music notes, building Goomba towers, planting seeds, catching birds, finding power moons underground, collecting moon shards, doing a timer challenge, finding Captain Toad, catching a rabbit, fishing with a Lakitu, almost every challenge all comes down to repeating things you've already done. After a certain point, the novelty of all of these challenges starts to wear off and it just becomes busy work. This is one of the issues that I've had with the moon rocks. Ideally, the moon rocks should have added in new pieces of content that would challenge the player, but for the most part, it just feels like a complete chore. It places brand new power moons all throughout the level, but once you find them, they're just sitting right in plain sight or they're hidden behind some other kind of trivial challenge that you've already seen. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the post-game is outright horrible, but I'd argue that it's just padded out to an insane degree. Your own enjoyment of the post-game will depend entirely on how long you are willing to repeat these kinds of challenges. I might not personally enjoy the post-game, but I can imagine that some players might find that the 999 power moon count has given Super Mario Odyssey a lot of value. For whatever reason, some players seem to value a video game that will take a long time to beat in order to feel like they're getting their money's worth. They'll take the cost of a game and calculate some sort of value based off of the dollars they spent per hour in order to justify that they didn't waste their money. I can understand where some players might be coming from, but for me personally, I'd rather have a video game do its thing and end at an appropriate length. I don't have any issues with games that take a long time to beat, but Super Mario Odyssey is clearly biting off more than it can chew, which is why I feel like the post-game is really disappointing. I do understand that it's completely optional, but it's a shame that the game peters out like this when the post-games of the previous games ended at more appropriate lengths. To put this in perspective, it took me around 11 hours to casually beat the game, and it took me an additional 30 hours just to achieve 100% completion. In those 30 hours, the only highlight was spending around 2 hours in the Mushroom Kingdom, while the rest of the post-game felt like pointless filler. In my opinion, the game could have cut out more than half of all the power moons and the game would have been better as a result. Like I said before, it seems like the developers went into development wanting the game to have 999 power moons. Clearly, I don't know if this was the case or not, but judging the game based off of how much padding there is, I can only assume that this was the case. One of the major reasons that I've come to this conclusion was because there aren't actually 999 power moons. In actuality, there's only 776 collectibles, and the remaining 223 power moons are essentially being used as filler. Nintendo accomplished this in many different ways. One of the least offensive methods that they used was the addition of the multi-moons. It's a special version of a power moon that's given to you after completing a main objective, and it's essentially one collectible that's worth 3 power moons. There's only 22 of these in the game, but since each one is worth 3, they were able to add in an extra 44 power moons for pretty much doing nothing. Since these are given to you for defeating bosses, I personally don't have a major problem with it, mostly because they're just a better reward. Sadly, the other methods that Nintendo used are much more blatant and obnoxious. For example, there are 60 power moons that are locked away behind an achievement system that requires absolutely no effort. This entire system is just a list of non-achievements that the player will end up doing by just collecting all 776 collectibles. If you've collected everything up to this point, you're already guaranteed to accomplish everything on this list, which makes the entire system feel completely meaningless. At the end of the day, it's just an excuse to give the player an additional 60 power moons for doing absolutely nothing. After having up to 880 power moons, the developers seem to have literally run out of ideas and just allowed the player to purchase additional power moons from the coin shop. In order to obtain the maximum amount, you now have to buy 119 power moons for around 12,000 coins. This is probably one of the low points of the entire game for me. At this point, I've collected every power moon in the game, but now I have to farm a bunch of coins in order to purchase more power moons for absolutely no fucking reason. If there was any proof that this game was intentionally padded out to have a total of 999 power moons, this is probably one of the biggest examples. It's an incredibly mundane activity that's just an excuse to increase some random superficial number. Now, to be fair, you do unlock the golden sail for 880 power moons, but it's just frustrating that the developers were desperately trying to reach this number without realizing how worthless these additions are. I can understand that they might enjoy the idea of having 999 power moons, but over 200 of those power moons are just filler, and I'd even argue that most of the power moons from the moon rocks are just filler as well. Now, despite a lot of the issues that I've had with the post game, I still felt motivated enough to see it through till the end. I was willing to put up with most of it because I was assuming that collecting every power moon would unlock something that would hopefully justify the amount of time I spent with the game. Maybe the game would unlock some kind of special world, or maybe some other kind of hidden ending that would hopefully make the experience worth it. Now, the rewards for achieving 100% completion have always been kind of terrible for the 3D Super Mario games. The worst one arguably being Super Mario Sunshine. In that game, you had to spend hours collecting every blue coin in the game only to get a postcard at the end of the credits. With that ending in mind, imagine spending over 40 hours of your free time, collecting hundreds of power moons, collecting every single purple coin in the game, playing through countless trivial challenges that you've already done multiple times, farming around 12,000 coins to purchase a bunch of power moons, only to get this. You can also fight a slightly harder version of the Bowser boss fight with the same exact ending. But don't you worry, we got the postcard, ladies and gentlemen. We got the fucking postcard. Oh my god. Fucking goddamn it. Now, in all seriousness, the draw to achieving 100% completion has never been these small rewards that you get at the end of the game. For me personally, it's more about completing all of the challenges up to the very end and hopefully having a worthwhile experience the whole way through. I usually don't aim to achieve 100% completion for most video games, but the 3D Super Mario games are somewhat special because each challenge is completely optional. After all, it's entirely possible that I could have missed out on some of the best sections in the entire game, so I try to avoid that issue by playing through everything. Of course, the downside to doing this is that the challenges hidden behind the post game are usually seen as optional content, so sometimes putting in the extra effort isn't really worth it. This is how I felt after playing Super Mario Odyssey. I could have beaten Super Mario Odyssey in around 6 hours, completely avoided the tedious nature of the post game, and have left the game with a more positive experience. Instead, I ended up completing every challenge and felt somewhat disappointed, despite the fact that I'm judging the game mostly based off of optional content. So, as someone who's trying to critique Super Mario Odyssey, this is one of the dilemmas that I've been facing. Do I judge the game up until the end credits, or do I judge the game up until 100% completion? Well, I suppose that it depends on whether or not I'm reviewing the game for a general audience, or if I'm critiquing the game as a longtime fan of the series. If I had to give a pretty broad review of Super Mario Odyssey, I would say that it's a really good game. It's easy to look at all the previous games and pick and choose which ones did certain things better, but once you're playing the game, it's not that big of a deal. Mario's movement is pretty good, the levels are large and fun to traverse, the game is paced well enough, the capture mechanic is a fun novelty, the music is fantastic, and for the most part, I can't say that I disliked any part of the game while I was playing it. A lot of the issues that I have with Super Mario Odyssey are more revolving around missed potential rather than outright terrible game design. That's why my first playthrough up until the end credits was an incredibly fun experience, and there's really no way that I can deny that. The post game might be somewhat repetitive, but if you honestly hate it, it's all optional content anyways. If I decided to make a short review for a more broad audience, that would summarize most of my thoughts, but clearly that's not the goal of this video. For a critique, my personal goal is to analyze every aspect of the game and determine what's keeping Super Mario Odyssey from being one of the best games of all time. That's why a lot of the issues that I've addressed in this video are actually somewhat minor. The unlock structure, the lack of an overworld hub, the capture mechanic, the somewhat bland level design, dumbing down the controls to promote a local 2-player mode that no one really cares about. These are things that sort of lessen the experience for me. These issues never ruin the game, but I also can't help myself from noticing these flaws and feeling like it could have been better. Honestly, the only aspect of the game that really ruined the experience was the overabundance of power moons and the tedious challenges required to get them. If you went back in time to 1998 and told me that Nintendo would make a 3D Super Mario game with 999 collectibles, I would have been really excited. After all, the whole appeal of having that many collectibles is the assumption that they're all hidden behind worthwhile challenges. Sadly, Super Mario Odyssey didn't pull this off like I would have assumed. The game resorts to using a lot of repetition in order to artificially lengthen the experience, with most of the power moons being obtained through trivial challenges. While those trivial challenges can feel similar to Super Mario 64, there simply isn't enough variety. The game will sometimes surprise you with a level-specific challenge, but for the most part, you'll be playing through a small variety of copy and pasted challenges. Because of this, the post-game for Super Mario Odyssey feels like a complete chore. You could argue that the post-game is completely optional, but I'd argue that some of the best 3D Super Mario games have been able to maintain their quality up until 100% completion. While I enjoy every game in the series, Super Mario 64 is easily the best one. Being the first game in the series, the developers didn't have to force in extra power stars if they weren't necessary. Because the game was designed in this manner, all 120 stars hidden within the game were placed behind meaningful challenges, making 100% completion a worthwhile endeavor. There's a handful of power stars that might require a bit of repetition, but once you've collected all 7 stars in a level, you can just move on to the next level. Because of this, the game was able able to maintain a constant pace throughout all 15 levels in the game, with only 15 stars being hidden in Princess Peach's castle. As a result of not having to design the game around any expectations, Super Mario 64 is one of the most balanced and consistent games in the entire series. The sequels weren't nearly as lucky. One of the problems with Super Mario Sunshine was that the game ended up being rushed, so there weren't enough levels to warrant the 120 star count. Obviously, the developers didn't have to include 120 stars, but since Super Mario 64 created a standard, there was probably a lot more pressure to aim for this amount. As a result of running out of time, they decided to include the ability to unlock shine sprites through the use of the blue coins, which made the experience feel somewhat inconsistent. The first half of the game was spent playing through all the fun challenges in each level, while the latter half was spent aimlessly collecting blue coins and playing through some of the most sadistic levels in the entire series. Super Mario Galaxy also aimed to have 120 stars, but it was able to pull this off in a much better fashion. The major galaxies in the game each had 4 stars and 2 comet stars, while the smaller galaxies only had 1. The overworld hub was pretty lackluster, but for the most part, the levels themselves made the entire experience feel pretty consistent. The only downside to the game was that there was some slight padding with the prankster comets, but I'd argue that most of the challenges are an extension of the 100 coin star. The time trial challenges and the repeated boss fights are a little harder to defend, but for the most part, they don't take too long to complete. Despite some of the minor problems, Super Mario Galaxy is arguably just as consistent as Super Mario 64, which made 100% completion a worthwhile endeavor. Looking at Sunshine and Galaxy, you can see how designing a game around a predetermined star count can create some gameplay mechanics that some players might not prefer. Of course, the benefit of the 3D Super Mario games is that it only affects players who want to achieve 100% completion. If you just want to beat the game and get to the credits, you can ignore the challenges that you dislike and have a great time. This is one of the main reasons why I decided to talk about the post-game in Super Mario Odyssey. The 3D Super Mario games are designed to present the best parts of the game right at the beginning, while hiding some of the worst parts during the post-game after most players will have stopped playing. The 3 previous games all had 120 stars, but the quality of the challenges required to collect them vastly differs between each game, with Super Mario Sunshine arguably being the worst. Some players might think that Super Mario Sunshine is the best game in the series, but chances are they probably never attempted to collect all the blue coins and walked away with a more positive outlook. You see, that's the dirty little secret for the 3D Super Mario games. They front load all the best parts of the game right before the credits, they get their perfect score from all the critics, and then they hide all the worst parts of the game until much later on. Similarly, Super Mario Odyssey does the same exact thing. The biggest highlights of the game are playing through each level up until the end credits. You unlock each level at a pretty fast pace, you collect a bunch of power moons, you have some good boss fights, you play through a lot of interesting challenges, and then you get your final boss fight and beat the game feeling ecstatic. Then the post-game starts off with the Mushroom Kingdom, and it's a pretty great level. There's a ton of callbacks to Super Mario 64, you can take control over Yoshi, but after you finish the level, the game sort of runs out of steam. You backtrack to the previous levels to unlock the Moon Rocks, it mostly comes across as filler, you spend around 80% of your entire playthrough hoping to find something interesting, but nothing really happens. In many ways, Super Mario Odyssey suffers from the same problems as Super Mario Sunshine. Both games aimed to have a predetermined power star count and couldn't create enough levels. While Super Mario Sunshine was simply rushed out before it was ready, Super Mario Odyssey attempted to outdo the earlier games 8-fold by simply being bigger. Of course, it doesn't matter how big the game is, the enjoyment that I get from the Super Mario series is from the challenges up until collecting the power stars. It's all about the journey rather than the destination. It's about running and jumping towards the flagpole. It doesn't matter how big the flagpole is or how many flagpoles are in the game. Super Mario Odyssey is essentially putting the cart before the horse. They should have focused on creating fun challenges and then designating each challenge with a power moon. Instead, the game just places power moons all over the place, regardless of thought. Super Mario Odyssey is the definition of quantity over quality. If it's worth doing once, it's worth doing 10 times again in a slightly different way. They might have made it bigger, but they definitely did not make it better. The power moons in Super Mario Odyssey are the equivalent of a $100 trillion bill from Zimbabwe. It's got a big number, but it ain't worth jack shit. Despite all the issues that I've had with Super Mario Odyssey, I still think that it's a pretty fun game. On my first playthrough, Super Mario Odyssey felt like an exciting trip around the world. I had a great time playing through each level, discovering some new kingdoms, and collecting power moons along the way. By the time that you reach the moon and get to the end credits, it's all a worthwhile experience that's on par with the earlier games in the series. Sadly, the game doesn't hold up the entire way through. After you've beaten the game, Super Mario Odyssey ceases to have new levels to travel to, and for the most part, the entire post-game is spent retreading old ground. The addition of the moon rocks also completely fails at creating new challenges. In that sense, the world and its challenges have already been discovered, and with that, the entire premise of the game goes out the window. The post-game also makes up around 80% of the entire experience, and there's simply not enough content to warrant the amount of time it takes. You see, like a trip around the world, Super Mario Odyssey can sometimes feel fucking exhausting. There's an overwhelming amount of power moons to collect, and most of it feels like needless busy work. As a longtime fan of the series, it's pretty easy to feel somewhat disappointed, but I also can't say that I outright dislike the game. The game has a lot of highlights. Most of them are all at the beginning, but they're good parts of the game nonetheless. The thing with Super Mario Odyssey is that it could have been better, but it also could have been a lot worse. So I'm glad that Nintendo was able to deliver a good game despite some of the obvious shortcomings.